All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the third day of Learning Labs for the ANH Academy Week 2022. My name is Elena Martinez, and I'll be the technical manager for this session titled Consumer Preferences and Their Implications for Food Systems Research. Thank you so much for taking part in ANH 2022. We look forward to a robust and interactive session today. I want to remind you that you can find the conference program on the ANH Academy website and the details for the Learning Lab Week and the research conference that will take place next week. Before we get started, I want to just give a few technical announcements. This session will be recorded and we'll post the recording on the ANH Academy website after the conference. All participants have been muted on entering the room, but feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat function, and we'll have plenty of opportunities for interaction during this session. If possible, we encourage you to turn on your webcam to participate in the session. If you experience any technical issues, please check your audio settings and internet connection, and you can also message us in the chat box. We have several members of the ANH Academy team on this call to help you field any issues that arise. So thank you so much, and I'll pass it over to Ellen McCullough to get the session started.
Thanks. Thank you, Elena. My name is Ellen McCullough. I am an assistant professor in the Agricultural and Applied Economics Department at the University of Georgia. And I helped organize this learning lab. So we're very excited to spend the next few hours with all of you discussing consumer preferences. So I'll first start by briefly introducing our team. We have Christine Chege, who's with the Alliance of Bioversity in SIAT. We have me. We have Yawoche Nove, who is a PhD student in the Ag and Applied Economics Department at University of Georgia. Chen Zhen, who is an associate professor in the Ag and Applied Economics Department of University of Georgia. And Joanne Arsenault, who is with FHI Solutions. Okay, so we are all part of a project called the Harnessing Food Demand Systems for Improved Nutrition in Sub-Saharan Africa project. And this is jointly funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the UK FCDO office. And our project is focused on improving tools for understanding how agricultural interventions and investments might impact diet quality in sub-Saharan Africa. So we're doing this by developing and applying state-of-the-art consumer demand modeling tools using recent high-quality microdata, nationally representative microdata in 6 different African countries. So that's where we're coming from, and we're going to share some of our research findings with you today. And we're also going to share some of the principles that underlie the practice of estimating consumer demand models. So that's where we're coming from. In our project, we're also seeking to build awareness among relevant decision makers about how consumer preferences play a role in determining how agricultural interventions and agricultural investments might impact diet quality. So this is part of that effort of building improved awareness and sharing some of our findings with the broader research community. Okay, so what do we mean by food demand systems modeling? So we kind of start in the middle here with a demand model. And the basic objective here is to try to explain household food consumption decisions using household income, prices, and other demographic characteristics. So the idea is a demand model is basically just a representation of the relationship between X and Y. So X is going to be our demand determinants, which would be income, prices, and demographics. And we're going to say a lot more about those in the coming minutes and hours. And then the Y is how much food is demanded. So we're really developing a model that maps X onto Y. And and we're using data, prices, and a lot of structural assumptions, which we'll talk about in order to implement this demand estimation. And then once we can estimate the relationship or this preference structure, as we'll say more about, the idea is to really help us to generate some food demand insights. So to look at what happens if you increase incomes, what happens to demand, what happens if you were to change the prices of different foods. Let's say you're able to double the productivity of teff in Ethiopia, lower teff prices. What's that going to do to overall consumer demand, not just for teff, but for also other food groups as well. So that's the general approach that we're taking here. And just a little bit about our project. So we're estimating these demand systems models in 6 different countries. And we are, we've done some consultation with policy stakeholders, both at the regional level and also within 3 countries that we've prioritized for policy outreach. We're writing papers about methods, about regional findings, and about country level findings. We're seeking input and feedback from relevant policymakers on these research outputs, and then we're doing outreach. So that's basically how we've been working in this project, which is starting to near its end. We'll be wrapping up by December. Okay. So for today's learning lab, we're focused on understanding why consumer preferences matter for food systems research. And our goal is to build an understanding amongst all of you about why we need to think about consumer preferences, to internalize and for you to internalize and reflect on some of the patterns that we're finding regarding consumer preferences from Sub-Saharan Africa using our demand systems application. And then also to help you all think and identify ways that you can incorporate an understanding of these consumer preferences into your own projects and research. So we'll spend some time thinking about that all together in breakout groups where you'll be aligned by your functional work priorities. Okay, so a brief overview of our agenda. I'm doing this motivation and objectives right now. I'll pass it over to Chen Zhen, who will teach us or cover the basic principles of consumer demand for food demand modeling. And then we'll have a learning application where you can all think and reflect on what you've learned. And then I will present our research results from estimating demand systems in 6 African countries. And then we'll have a breakout group to discuss and reflect on some of those patterns that we're seeing. And we'll report back and discuss back here in the plenary. And then there will be one more breakout group where you will reflect on ways that you might incorporate some of these principles of consumer demand into your own work, whatever that may be. And then we will wrap up and conclude. So a couple of logistics. I have a Dropbox folder that is open to everybody where all of the materials are pasted. I'm putting the URL into the chat. And you can also scan this URL. So we're going to show this at multiple times throughout the session. If you ever need to get into that Dropbox folder, definitely I encourage you to. So we've got all of our slides there and the working paper, and so you might find it helpful to reference these documents in some of the breakout groups, especially. If anyone has any technical challenges, find Elena in the main Zoom room chat. You should always be able to pop out of a breakout group and find her. You can, of course, also ask your session facilitator if you're in a breakout. But Elena should be able to help you out with anything that comes up. Okay, so with that, I will pass things over to Chen to present. I'm going to stop my share to present the basic overview of consumer demand concepts.
Yeah, so hi, everyone. My name's Chen Zhen. I'm a colleague of Alan at the University of Georgia. So because we are really having an interdisciplinary group of attendees, Alan thought it would be very useful if I can give a primer on consumer demand modeling techniques. So a little bit background on myself. I've spent 20 years almost exclusively on consumer food demand modeling. So I've seen a lot and I've also done a lot. So but today's is really introductory. So if you are already trained as economist, you should be already very familiar with this. So this is all these slides are intended for people who are not trained as economists. So, okay, first one. So the theory of consumer economics, economists have a lot of theories, but the first principal theory of consumer economics is that when prices go up, demand should come down. Okay, so the economists don't agree on a lot of things, but this first principle is what I can say everyone agrees on. If things get more expensive, the quantity demanded would come down. Graphically, if you plot a two-dimensional plot, say on the vertical axis, you have the quantity demanded, and on the horizontal axis, you have prices, then what you should see is a downward sloping demand curve. Whether you draw a straight line or a curvy line, we call that thing a demand curve, but that thing should be downward sloping. There's really no debate. And there are two other predictions, theoretical predictions, that economists come up with that are debated because they are not always empirically supported. The first thing is what we call the homogeneity, which is saying that if all prices and your income goes up by the same proportion, then your demand should stay the same. To give you an example, like I don't know about the globally, but in the US, we have a huge inflation right now. So what if homogeneity, this theory holds true, that means if your inflation, say our inflation is say 8%, and if your employer give you a 8% raise, that should change your demand. It should not change your demand at all, because you realize that 8% income increase is really all used up, all exhausted by the 8% inflation. So homogeneity, empirically using data, we don't always find this argument to hold. So it's still being debated. The second, even more controversial, is called symmetry. Symmetry is saying that the effect of good A price on good B demand is really the same as the effect of good B price on good A demand. Meaning in layman's terms that if you find A and B as to be substitutes, and then you should also find B and A to be substitutes. And this second point is symmetry also being debated. So from these slides, you can see that we have three theoretical predictions. First one, no debate, globally accepted. The second and third one still being debated. And our modeling approach to allow us to impose the second and third, give us the option to impose the second and third, or not to impose them. So it gives us a lot of flexibility in that regard. So then the economists like jargons. So I'm going to throw a few jargons here because when I attend a lot of interdisciplinary conferences. What I notice is that whenever we say elasticities, people get very confused. And so here I want to define what price elasticity is. So when we say price elasticity of the demand, it is really a measure of how sensitive demand is to a price change. If you have a very high price elasticity of demand, that means when price change, you are going to either increase your demand or decrease your demand by a lot, depending on whether the price change is positive or negative. So for example, if we say we have our own price elasticity of negative 0.8, that means a 10% increase in good A price will lead to an 8% decline in good A demand. The reason we call the own price elasticity is saying that here the demand is responding to a change in the own price. Okay, why do we need to make this distinction? Because the next slide, we're going to define the cross price elasticity, which is going to be very important for this project. For this project, we pay a very close attention to the cross price effect. So sometimes people call that spillover effect. So Alan is going to give you to talk a lot more about those, but here I'm just going to give you a definition. So I think a lot of audience are working in the public health arena. So you probably heard a soda tax. So do we have a consensus on price elasticity for sugar sweetened beverages or soda? We kind of have that elasticity, that consensus mean is negative 0.2. What that means is if soda price go up by 10%, demand for soda will come down by 12%, okay? And then for tobacco, which we have studied for decades, the consensus there is even stronger. It is negative 0.4, meaning if a cigarette tax increase the price by 10%, quantity demanded for cigarettes will come down by 4%. Okay, so that's a mean estimate that the economists kind of have a consensus on. So that's the own price elasticity. And now I tell you what the cross price elasticity means. So the cross price elasticity tells you how much does the demand for good A change when the price of good B changes. So the sign, this cross, because of the downward sloping demand, we should always have a negative own price elasticity. Okay, but for cross price elasticity, you can either have a positive or negative. When they are positive, we are saying these two products are substitutes. For example, we know regular soda. Did someone have a question? Okay, all right. So when the cross price elasticity are positive, we say that the A and the B, the two goods are substitutes. For example, is the full calorie soda, which we call the regular soda, and the low calorie soda, they are generally agreed to be substitutes. Meaning, if you tax regular soda, people will switch to low calorie soda. Okay, so price of regular soda goes up, demand for low calorie soda goes up. Okay, because the price and the quantity go in the same direction. In this case, the cross price elasticity is positive. Okay, that's when they are substitutes. But we also can have a negative cross price elasticity. When that happens, we're going to say A and B are complements. Okay, the easiest example of that is coffee and coffee creamer. Okay, so if coffee becomes more expensive, people drink less coffee. No debate about that. Because of downward sloping demand, less demand for coffee means what? Means less demand for cream. So coffee cream, in that case, are complements, meaning that coffee price go up, demand for cream comes down. Again, you get a negative cross price elasticity. Okay, so that's a definition of cross price elasticity. And then I'll go to the next slide. So that's all about the prices. And now I want to spend one or two slides on expenditure elasticities. So expenditure elasticity really measures how much your demand will change if you basically have more income, higher income. So as you get wealthier, how much your demand will change. So when the expenditure elasticity of demand is greater than 1, we say you got a luxury good. So what could be a luxury good? Luxury cars. Luxury cars is definitely a luxury good. What happens as you get richer? Your demand, your desire for having a to own a luxury car increase by how much? By more than your income increase. So that's how you can get a elasticity, expenditure elasticity demand greater than 1. If that happens, then the good of interest is called a luxury good. For food, over the entire range of income, I think on average, we would like to think good food as a normal good. What is a normal good? Normal good has an expenditure elasticity of demand that is between 0 and 1, meaning expenditure or income increased by 10%, demand will increase by less than 10%. Demand will increase by more than 0%, but less than 10%. Okay, why do I say over the entire range of income? Because for extremely low income, we could have some food category being luxury, because if the household is coming out of extreme poverty, as their income increase a little bit, their demand for food could increase by more than their income increase in percentage terms. But as your income gets larger and larger and larger, usually what happens, your expenditure elasticity of demand for food would decline. The example I give always is, think about Elon Musk, the richest person in the world. If Tesla stock price increased by $100, Elon Musk's wealth probably increased by billions of dollars. But does that have an impact on how much food Elon Musk eats? 0. Okay, why? Because you cannot eat unlimited quantity of food. That's biologically impossible. So for super rich, their elasticity of demand for food, their income elasticity demand for food is close to 0. But for people, for normal income people, we have usually somewhere between 0 and 1. So, and finally, we could have inferior good. Inferior good is a kind of food that your income increase, then your demand decrease. Usually these are a low quality food that you could only afford when you have very low income. That's the only thing you can afford when you have super low income. But as you get richer and richer, then you don't want to consume them. So here example is the value brand toilet paper. As you get richer, then you probably want to buy a name brand toilet paper. So value brand paper will be an inferior good. Just give you an example here. Okay, so the next thing is still about expenditure elasticity of demand, but it's really on the modeling side that we would like to note. So if you're an economist and if you have read a lot of articles on consumer food demand modeling, you probably would have noticed that most people, the vast majority of studies, I would say 95% of studies, are modeling incorrectly the expenditure elasticity. What most people are doing is that they are modeling how demand for food groups change with respect to total food expenditure, okay, rather than total household expenditure or income. What's the distinction? Total food expenditure is a sum of your expenditure on food, but that's it. Total household expenditure include other things: durables, non-durables, services, education, travel, leisure, transportation, all those kind of things. Why should we model total household expenditure instead of food expenditure? Because if your goal is to use the elasticity to inform policy, food expenditure itself is really not exogenous to food prices. What we mean by that is food expenditure will change as the food price change. So policy modeling, what that means is that you can really not hold the food expenditure fixed, and therefore the food expenditure elasticity really not useful if your goal is to model policy. And by contrast, total household expenditure is relatively exogenous to food prices. That's why we want to model total household expenditure instead of food expenditure, total food expenditure elasticity. So that's a reason there. Then those are all series. So then I want to spend 2 slides on what is the econometrics behind this. So economic theory offers prediction on the direction of consumer price response to price and income changes, but it never tells you by how much. Okay, you may have preconception or intuition about whether demand for a food product is elastic or inelastic, or whether a food is a luxury food or an inferior food or a non-normal food. But those are just your guesses. Okay, we want to have evidence support. How do you get empirical evidence? We need to apply for econometrics. We need to apply econometrics to study, to quantify the elasticity, to quantify consumers' preferences. Then what is econometrics? Basically, econometrics basically is a statistical measurement of the economic relationship using data. Okay, so if you have ever used the statistical modeling techniques, I would say the econometrics techniques we use is very similar. The only big difference is that here we're using data collected from people, from human beings. We're measuring human behavior. And then because we're measuring human behavior or modeling human behavior, we call it econometrics. If you are a biologist, people call that biometrics. Okay, so the metrics part is the same. It's the prefix that's different depending on discipline. So for the econometric food demand models, what do? First, we estimate the shape of the demand curves with respect to prices and incomes. Economists tell us that demand curve should always be downward sloping with regard to own prices, but it never tells you how much, the degree in which it should be downward sloping. But the data can tell us a lot more. Okay, and also we measure heterogeneities, meaning differences in household preferences associated with household characteristics, culture, and geography. So we've got six country studies. We look at how different or how similar people's preferences are across countries. And also here we use what we call structural modeling. The structural modeling is really can tell us a lot more about the cross price effects as opposed to the reduced form modeling. Reduced form modeling, an example is say if you run a field experiment, you got the treatment and control, you got the pre and the post. So what you can do there, you can use difference in differences or triple difference models to estimate the causal effect of a policy. That's when you have a field experiment or you have a natural experiment. We call those models reduced form. Here we are employing structural models using observational data, not experimental. The reason we don't use experimental data for demand analysis is that we are interested in hundreds of cross price effects. We cannot run hundreds of arms because usually if you have a field experiment, you want to test one intervention, you have at least two arms, a control, a treatment. But here we're interested potentially in hundreds of cross price effects, which is going to exhaust the number of treatment and controls we could afford to have. So that's why we use observational data, and then we use structural modeling to capture all those effects simultaneously. And then finally, the final slide is to give you a graphical example of what we're trying to do here. So here you can see on the vertical axis, we have quantity. So on the horizontal, we got the prices. What those blue dots are data. Each blue dot represents one data point. Say each data point represents one household consumption in a given period. So you see some households pay higher prices, but consume lower quantities. Other households pay lower prices, but they consume higher quantities. So you got a lot of dots. And then our econometric model will tell you which line we got the DD and the BB. These two lines are potentially your demand curve for this sample of households. But which demand curve is the best? Which one is the better? The econometrics model will tell us. Basically, we use a maximum likelihood technique, but one technique you probably all heard of was called the ordinary least squares, OLS. So in that case, you will be minimizing the square, the difference between the line and the dots. Whichever line gives you the minimum distance will be the line that best represent the consumer preferences for this particular food in your particular sample. So graphically, this is basically what we're trying to do. And that concludes my primer on consumer demand analysis. I'll give the floor back to Alan.
Thank you, Chen. Okay, so I'll go back to our overview slide here. So this is where we are. We are going to have a brief learning application, and I will invite Yawoche to say more about that now.
Yes, thank you. So my name is Yao Chenube. I'm a PhD candidate in Agricultural and Applied Economics at the University of Georgia. So this learning activity is to reflect on key consumer demand that is presented by, but that is just presented by Dr. Chenzen. So we will share the link. So there's no right or wrong answer in this. So the idea is for you to reflect on those key consumer theory or consumer demand concept that are just presented. Feel free to put any question you have in the chat, and we will answer that. So, Dr. Ellen, can we share the link?
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and transition us now to the presentation of research results. So we're excited now to share some findings from empirical applications of demand model estimation from 6 African countries. Here's what we're doing. So we wanted to ask the question, in 6 African countries, how does diet quality respond when there are changes in food prices and in consumers' total expenditures or incomes? I'll use income and expenditures kind of interchangeably. Empirically, we're using total expenditures, but the idea is similar. Okay, so what our empirical approach is that we're estimating these demand systems using nationally representative household panel data sets. And we use the panel piece because we really want to highlight, we really want to understand how consumers, say, respond to different prices, not by comparing, say, consumers in the north of a country have high prices for a crop and in the south of a country have low prices. We don't want to understand how demand responds to changes in prices by comparing consumers in the north to consumers in the south. We want to look over time within a location as prices change or as consumer incomes change, what happens to demand within that location. So we really want to focus on what we believe to be a more realistic type of variation for understanding these behavioral responses to changing prices and incomes. So we're using panel data for this, and I'll say a little bit more about that coming up. We also we want to look not just at how much of different crops is consumed, but we want to look at the implications for the diet as a whole of the demand patterns that we see. So here we're going to talk about three different measures of diet quality, and I'll say more about these in a minute, but we're looking at overall sufficiency relative to estimated requirements, average requirements, say of intake of dietary energy or of key macro or micronutrients. We're going to look at the overall macronutrient balance of the diet. So what share of your total dietary energy intake is coming from carbohydrates, from fat, from protein. And we're going to look at the nutrient density of the diet using the nutrient-rich foods index, which I'll say more about. And then once we kind of understand these basic relationships, how sensitive is intake to different price changes, to expenditure changes, et cetera, then we're going to simulate, okay, what were to happen if we were to, for instance, implement a cash transfer targeting poor households and raising their incomes by a fixed amount. What would happen to diet quality? Would we see more households who are consuming sufficient quantities of iron or of zinc? So that's the basic overall empirical framework that we're using. We're estimating a preference structure, and then we're using simulations to look at what happens if we change some of these demand drivers, what happens to diets. And just a little bit of motivation background. Our main impetus is really to understand this market role, the consumer demand aspect of diet quality. There's been a lot of emphasis on what happens if we change the income of smallholder households, what happens to their diets. We really want to take a step back and look broadly at markets. We know from the Green Revolution that global progress in lowering real food prices and in reducing poverty has had a huge impact on improving diet quality, reducing undernutrition. And we want to really take that idea further and look more at specific elements of diet quality, and to use recently available micro data and the best modeling tools to empirically take a look at this issue now. African consumers today, how responsive are they? How responsive is their diet quality going to be to growth in total incomes, to growth in, or to changing prices of different crops? So we're using, as I mentioned, nationally representative panel data. They're all parts of the LSMS ISA initiative, which is the Living Standards and Measurement Study, Integrated Surveys in Agriculture. So we're using data from Malawi, Niger, Ethiopia, Uganda, Tanzania, Nigeria. And I'll present the results kind of in this country order. We ordered them just by average per capita expenditures, just to have a way to order them. So that's kind of from lowest to highest. This is how the countries are ordered. And so this is how we'll present the results. One exception in our data is that in Ethiopia, urban households didn't come in until the second and third rounds. So in our panel, we just use the rural and small town households. So the Ethiopia results, their sample is a little bit different. It's not urban. In the other countries, it's urban and rural. And we're using all the rounds that we have, except in Tanzania, another fourth round was added, but it has a totally different set of enumeration areas. So we don't include that one. And in our demand model, we're looking at food consumption. And this is based on a 7-day recall. We ask the household what of the long list of items, it's say 56 items on average, which of these items did you consume in your household? We group those into categories based on similar nutritional profile and similar function in the diet. And then we take that data so we can observe whether the household purchased it from a market, or whether they produced it themselves, or whether they received it as a gift or a transfer. If they purchased it, then we're able to construct a unit price, a unit value, which is the quantity that they acquired divided by the total expenditures, the total expenditures divided by the quantity acquired. And so then we also have other household data we take from these surveys, which we're going to use to get the total expenditures, which Chen talked about why total household expenditures are important. And also the characteristics of the household. We also talked about heterogeneity of tastes and preferences. So we include these household characteristics in our model in order to account for some of this heterogeneity. And then we're going to use nutrition data to map individual food items onto their composition, and also to construct at the household level an average requirement for each macro and micronutrient and for dietary energy. So, we have different requirements, say for a child, a young child, or an active adult, or an elder person. So we use these requirements based on the composition of the household to come up with a total household specific requirement. Okay, our demand model, don't worry if you don't want to look at equations this morning or afternoon, wherever you are. You will not be tested on this. Your testing is over. Basically, we've chosen a functional form that's flexible. So the general idea that we want you to take away is that we allow for a very flexible relationship between total household expenditures, which is Y, and demand. This model can take up to a fifth order polynomial. And we also allow the price effects to vary over households' total expenditures. This gives another element of flexibility that's not present in other commonly used demand models like the quadratic AIDS model, which is probably the most commonly used alternative demand model. Basically, this model is a system of equations. So think one equation of budget share is a dependent variable, budget share on each food group, and then the dependent variable. The independent variables are prices, household expenditure to a polynomial up to 5. Prices interacted with the household expenditures. These household demographic controls that we talked about, demand preference shifters, and that's that. So basically, we're estimating demand for this all the food groups, and for the non-food numeraire group, all in one system of equations. And then when we talk about assessing diet quality, I mentioned we're looking at adequacy of intake. So we construct a household level estimated average requirement for each nutrient. I use nutrient broadly here because it includes dietary energy, protein, fat, iron, zinc, vitamin A, and total folate. So we're going to look at, okay, is intake sufficient? Does this household appear to have sufficient intake of everything relative to its own estimated average requirement? We look at the balance of different macronutrients and total dietary energy intake. So we expect carbohydrates to be between 55 and 75%, protein between 5 and 10%, fat between 15 and 30%. And consuming outside of these ranges can indicate imbalance, either due to over or under consumption. And then we take as one metric, we had to choose one, overall diet quality. We use the nutrient-rich foods index, which is a measure of a diet's nutrient density. So it's basically per 2,000 calories of dietary energy. We get the NRFI goes up as you have more and more micronutrient density in that diet. And then it goes down if you have more excess sodium, saturated fat, added sugar. So it's meant to be a really balanced index that improves as the diet gets better and goes down if components of the diet get worse. And we'll show you a little bit what that looks like. Okay, so I'm going to graphically represent our preferences, and I apologize for the small font here. These slides are available for download in the Dropbox link that I shared before, and I also have, yeah. So I'll say a little bit more about that. But you can flip through all these results kind of at your leisure if it's more comfortable. The basic idea here is that we show in each cell what is the total expenditure elasticity of demand for each of these foods and for each consumer expenditure quartile. So here are the poorest consumers. They're below the international $1.90 a day extreme poverty line. The second quartile is consumers between that $1.90 and $3.20 a day. Third quartile is less than $5.50 a day per capita household expenditures, and Q4 is above that. And so the idea here is that where you see a really solid blue, that means expenditure elastic demand. That means if these, in this case, the left column is poor consumers, if their expenditures go up by 10%, their demand for soft drinks is going to go up by 30%. So that's very expenditure elastic. One pattern we see here is that as consumers get wealthier, they don't show as high demand. Here is where your Elon Musk of Malawi will be, and you know, this household will not necessarily take an extra million kwacha and spend an extra 3 million kwacha on soft drinks. So that's the general relationship here. And what we've done with our diet, with our nutritional data is so let's say consumer expenditures increase by 10%. Then we've looked at, okay, what happens to intake of all of the different components of the diet, all the different nutrients. What happens to those when we sum up all of these food demand effects? So we see that fat increases by about 1%, or sorry, maybe 1.5%. That's the most expenditure elastic nutrient, you know, as a result of all of these different responses of demand. As expenditures go up, we see fat intake increasing the most, followed by vitamin A and total folate. And we don't see particularly expenditure elastic demand for, say, carbohydrates. So now I'm going to encourage you to look at the slide. I'm going to flip through all 6 countries. I don't expect you to internalize all these results, but I want you to just see that there's important differences in the overall patterns. You know, if you're interested in the nutrient intake, I would say look over here at the right side of the screen. And you see that in different countries, the profile of the diet responds differently to an increase in expenditures. And you can see these changes across the expenditure distribution, and you can see also across different nutrients. So this is Malawi. I'm going to flip forward to Niger. So here we see it's more protein rather than fat that consumers are demanding the most of. We see that the food items that are most expenditure elastic are roots and tubers, red meat for poor consumers, followed by fish and seafood, rice, wheat. If we move up to Ethiopia, we see fat, vitamin A, zinc, iron and protein are the most expenditure elastic. The consumer demand is more focused on red meat, eggs, and dairy. Here in Uganda, we see protein and zinc are the most expenditure elastic nutrients. We see Ugandan consumers who are poor like to spend their extra expenditures as expenditures grow on eggs, fish and seafood, poultry, fruit, and rice, and soft drinks. Tanzania, we see fat, protein, vitamin A, poultry, red meat, and rice. Coffee, tea, soft drinks are the strongest goods that these consumers are demanding. And now if we look at Nigeria, there's not a very high expenditure elasticity demand for really any of these nutrients. We see the most demand for coffee and tea and red meat. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the relationship between food prices and demand for different goods. So what we see here is a matrix of all of the price, cross price and own price effects. So on the x-axis, this lists all of the food groups. I apologize for the small font, but again, I encourage you to download the slides and take a look, or you can zoom in as much as you want. So here we see that, you know, say the price of maize in Malawi, if it increases by 1%, then we can see what happens to demand for all of the other food groups, including maize. So the own price elasticity is going to be on the diagonal. Again, we always expect these to be negative, but they could be very small, or they could be quite large. And then on the y-axis, we're going to see all of the other demands. So when the price of maize goes up, we see a strong decrease in consumption of roots and tubers, of red meat, of poultry, of tea, and of soft drink. These are going to be the complements. If we see a blue box, that's going to be a substitute. So we see more demand for vegetables as the price of maize goes up. So an interesting thing that we see here is that as we look across all of these responses, say when the maize price goes up, we can look at what happens as consumers have all of these cross price and own price effects, what happens to the dietary intake of all of the dietary components. And here we see a very strong decrease in intake of pretty much everything when the maize price goes up. So here the maize price is a very strong determinant of intake of a bunch of different macro and micronutrients, dietary energy, protein, fat, carbohydrates, iron, zinc, vitamin A, folate. You don't see any other prominent band here. Maybe roots and tubers are kind of important, pulses are kind of important, but Malawi is a maize-dominated country, and you really see that when the maize price goes up, intake suffers in a major way of pretty much everything. And this is for poor consumers. So I'm going to flip through and show you some other countries here. Niger, it's a millet-dominated country. So we see the same pattern for millet. Not so much, it's not the strongest determinant of vitamin A intake per se, but it's really everything else, a super strong determinant. Rice prices also important for poor consumers in Niger, as are red meat prices, but millet matters the most. And again, this is coming out of the preference structure, the prices, cross price and own price elasticities that we're estimating from these consumers. If we look at Ethiopia, which is not dominated by a single staple, we don't see one red band that's super dark. We see sort of a zone of responses from Ethiopian consumers to teff prices, to maize prices, to wheat prices, and to the prices of pulses. And we also see that vitamin A intake has kind of a different set of determinants than does pretty much all the other nutrients. If we look at Uganda, this is again not dominated by one single staple. There's a lot of, or several staples that are important. We see kind of a zone of light red here, intake across all the food staples. Collectively, they're important, but there's not one single food staple that's driving intake of all the macro and micronutrients. Tanzania, we're back to a maize-dominated country. We see this vertical band here pretty strong. Maize prices are an important determinant. Interestingly, of fat intake, which maize is not particularly fatty, but because of the substitutes and complementarities that we see in the consumer demand response to maize prices, we see that fat intake goes down a whole lot when the maize price goes up. Okay, and finally in Nigeria, this is a country that's not dominated by a single staple, so we don't see any one staple as particularly important driver of micronutrient or macronutrient intake. Okay, so I know I don't have much time. I'm going to take about 2 to 3 more minutes to talk about our policy simulations here. So we simulated a cash transfer, which is a fixed transfer to all consumers of cash. So we simulated what happens if we increase consumer expenditures. And then and we made some assumptions just to allow this to be empirically tractable. But just think, cash transfer fixed at about 20% of poor households' expenditures. And then we also looked at a price voucher. So what happens if you were to reduce the price of all staple grains by 25%, or of starchy staples, pulses and nuts, fruits and vegetables for animal source foods. And we look at what happens to intake. So here we're looking at what happens to dietary intake of energy when we increase expenditures, so the cash transfer. And the change in energy intake is on the shaded vertical axis for each country. And the x-axis is each household's per capita expenditures before the transfer. So we see an increase, the y-axis is the share of households who have sufficient dietary energy. These households that are to the left of this Q1 cutoff are all of our poor, extremely poor households. And we see that as we transfer cash to these households, there's a major increase in the share of households with sufficient dietary energy intake. The effect, if we were to transfer cash to wealthier households, the effect on the share is smaller. So we're seeing these effects are very, very large for poor households on dietary energy. Okay, now this is kind of a simulation of, or a depiction of all of the policy simulation effects. If we look at what happens for poor households, what happens if we transfer, what happens to dietary energy if we transfer cash versus if we use price vouchers. So if we look here at this bottom blue line, this is the share of households in Ethiopia before the transfer who have sufficient dietary energy intake. Share of poor households, it's very low. If we do the cash transfer, this little X up here, you increase the share of households from about 10% to 20% to share of poor households with the cash transfer. With a staple food subsidy of 25%, that's the circle, you increase the share of households with sufficient dietary energy intake by about 10% to 15%. Subsidizing other foods doesn't really do much to the share of households with sufficient dietary energy. So we can look at all of the effects. The line is always the baseline level, baseline share of households with sufficient intake, and we can see how much does this move with the different interventions. So here, like in Malawi, when we subsidize, or when we do the cash transfer, we see a huge increase in the share of households with sufficient vitamin A intake. We don't really see that the staple food, grain subsidy has a major effect, but starchy staples subsidy has a pretty large effect. If we look at protein intake, we see some movement from subsidizing or lowering the price of animal source foods, which is this cross on the far right. But there's more movement from lowering the prices of staple grains than animal source foods. So again, you can reflect on these in your when we have a little bit more time, but I just wanted to kind of walk you through what these responses look like. We can also look at the impact on dietary macronutrient balance. So this shows the share of households who have too much carbohydrates in Uganda after the dashed line is at baseline, and then after each of these different simulations, what happens. So we increase the share of households with too much carbohydrates when we subsidize starchy staples, but there's really not an impact on the share of households. And we lower it, so when we subsidize pulses, we're improving this problem of overconsumption of carbohydrates. When we subsidize starchy staples, we're making it worse. When we subsidize pulses, we're increasing the share of households with too much fat, but we're also lowering some households who have not enough fat. With protein, we are when we subsidize starchy staples, we have more households that consume too low of proteins, and we're also helping a little bit households who don't consume enough, but we're making it worse for some households too. So the idea here is that we can look across the different simulations and just make sure. I mean, the biggest concern here is that if we transfer cash to households, that we might see more households who have too much fat as a share of their dietary energy, which would indicate overconsumption. And we don't really see across the countries. These are available to you as backup slides. I'm not going to go through all the countries, but we don't see that there's a problem with cash transfers exacerbating overconsumption of fats. So what we see is across the board, the cash transfer lowers any evidence of underconsumption, and it doesn't exacerbate signs of overconsumption. Price vouchers for staple foods and starchy staples exacerbate problems of overconsumption of carbohydrates, and they also exacerbate problems of underconsumption of fats and of proteins in Tanzania, Niger, and Nigeria. And the CT lowers signs of underconsumption in two countries, in Malawi and in Tanzania. Okay, so we have this kind of one metric of nutrient-rich foods index, and we can talk about how that metric is affected by these transfers. So the cash transfer, the NRFI goes up for poor households in almost all countries, but not universally. So in Niger and in Tanzania, it actually goes down a little bit. When we subsidize staple grains, NRFI gets worse in most countries. When we subsidize starchy staples, it improves in all countries. When we subsidize pulses, it improves in all countries except in Nigeria, where it goes down just by a small amount. When we subsidize fruits and vegetables, it goes up in 3 of the countries by quite a bit, but it goes down by a very small amount in 3 countries. When we subsidize animal source foods, it goes up in most cases except in Niger. Okay, I'm going to stop there, except I'll just highlight that these price vouchers have different costs per country, because the cost of implementing a price voucher depends on how much consumers demand of the food group after they receive this subsidized price. Pulses and nuts, I think, are just worth highlighting here, because we do see pretty much universally positive response to pulse and nut price vouchers, and they're not very expensive. If we compare them to subsidizing staple grains for poor households, that can cost 4 to 5 times as much in a country compared to subsidizing pulses and nuts, which are relatively inexpensive. So I'll just flag that it's worth looking at the cost when you're also looking at the nutritional benefits of these vouchers. Okay, so some limitations. Again, I'm going to wrap up now, go quickly through this. So we have to make some assumptions in order to do this modeling, mostly about equitable distribution within the household. And our policy stimulations are very stylized. In order to do these, we can't model income effects or equilibrium price effects from any of these interventions. So we do see a very strong link between growth in expenditures and diet quality improvement. But we also see lots of evidence of intake gaps and dietary imbalance, even for high-income consumers. And we see evidence that cash transfers can really close intake gaps without exacerbating balance problems. And cross-price effects are very important for diet quality. So we really see these food staple prices are very important drivers of macro and micronutrient intake, especially in countries that really have one set of one major food staple versus a set of multiple food staples. And we see that we could help to close some nutrient intake gaps with price vouchers, especially for pulses and nuts, staple foods, and starchy staples. But some price vouchers really exacerbate dietary balance problems. Okay, so I will stop there. I apologize, I went over. I am going to hand it over now. I will look at the chat questions and respond to those in the chat. And I will hand it over to Joanne now. I will share our PowerPoint slides, Joanne.
Okay. And I guess you can let me know, Ellen, if you want to make any adjustment to the time allotment. But for this next week breakout, we're going to have a breakout session, which was scheduled for 15 minutes. And we basically have 2 questions that we would like you to reflect on demand patterns. And there is a Google Doc where we would welcome you to, enter your answers into the Google Doc, take a few minutes at the beginning, and then we'll have just a general discussion. And we have these breakout groups by disciplinary backgrounds. So you're thinking about, reflecting on this for your discipline or area of expertise. And so again, we have the Dropbox folder if you want to look back at a slide to refresh your memory. But yeah, that's basically it. And then we'll come back and have a very brief discussion. Okay, so I think we have the next 10 minutes allotted for kind of reporting back and Q&A. Are we still good with 10 minutes? Yeah. Okay. So 10 minutes isn't very much time. So I don't know if we probably have about 2 minutes for each group to report back, which may not allow any time for questions, much time for questions. So I can just share very, very quickly in my group. We had a quiet group and I think they were overwhelmed, like maybe even I was to some extent with all the results going by quickly. And but yeah, at least one of the counterintuitive issues that came up was just, the price, I guess the price vouchers for different foods, just having different, maybe not always what you would expect, and having different, different effects in different countries. But yeah, I think it would take more time to kind of internalize, specifically what those were and why in a particular country. So I don't think we came up with any answer on that. So I guess if one of the other, if group 2, if you want to just give a 1 or 2 minute debrief on your session.
Yeah, I can quickly give a brief of our session also. So we had very good discussions there, also trying to check through what was intuitive and surprising. And yes, everyone was like, the results were too many. They were trying to get through the results and think across the different findings. But one of the things that came out was that the demand seems to decrease mostly for animal foods and coffee, things like coffee, tea, as the prices increase. And also there was a discussion around the changes between the different policy innovations. Like, for example, the voucher, when the vouchers are given, what is happening to the different consumption of different food items. And that actually came out also as an interesting point, where someone in our group mentioned that these would be very interesting results for conducting this kind of analysis would be very interesting for designing program interventions, especially when thinking of kind of humanitarian interventions. Because if you think of a voucher program, then how is that going to affect maybe consumption of different other food items and diets generally? And then also there was the point on giving the analysis, also giving insights in terms of helping to design programs that are mainstreaming nutrition, especially the agricultural programs that are looking at mainstreaming nutrition. So the team appreciated that this kind of modeling would be very helpful to help design such programs. So in a nutshell, I think that's what came in our group, but we have a few other points in our Google Doc. Over, John.
Okay, great. Group 3.
Okay. Again, sorry, I think our group was also a little overwhelmed. Some of the issues that everyone noted, some of the not outliers in a statistical sense, but some of the sort of anomalous patterns that we saw in some of the countries. So we discussed the fact that there's negative expenditure elasticity of demand for eggs in Nigeria. That seemed very surprising to the group. We're not quite sure why that's happening, but it seems like red meat for poor consumers in Nigeria is very expenditure elastic. So it might be that there is a goat or other product in Nigeria that the very poor consumers are really preferring as their expenditures go up, more so than poultry-based products. Let's see, we also talked about how surprising it was that Ethiopia has really high vitamin A expenditure elasticity of intake compared to the other nutrients. And one thing we spent a little bit of time talking about was that vitamin A intake in Nigeria is just very, very low. 0% of poor households have sufficient intake. So it is possible to achieve a high elasticity when you have a very, very low base. So that might be what's happening. And animal source foods do have high expenditure elasticities in Ethiopia, and those are a pretty good vehicle for vitamin A intake. Let's see, what else did we talk about? We talked about kind of some of the adjustments that might not be reflected in these results, like that very poor consumers might be sort of consuming different, like portions of crops, like maybe the stalks or very low quality portions of an item, and we might not really be able to observe that in our data. Or we also talked about how if there's something like a transfer of cooking oil, a very large safety net program, that if that's happening in the background as we're estimating these demand systems, it also could potentially alter our results. I think these are all interesting points that we can certainly explore further. And then we also talked about, what it might mean if we're estimating one set of demand system parameters at a national level, as opposed to where we have sort of different agroecologies, different types of diets, et cetera. In terms of implications for our group, which was agriculture folks, we found that developing new crop varieties that offer diversity of nutrients might help ensure the system is more resilient. So if a price changes, that it's not going to be as destructive to intake of micronutrients, which I think is an interesting point. It's kind of almost like at the same time you want to focus on the stable because that's such a driver of intake, but you also want to focus on diversifying so that you're not as sensitive to the price of one staple in the system. So it's kind of like do everything, diversify the offerings, but also don't make sure your productivity of that main staple doesn't suffer too much. So that's a summary of our discussion. Thank you.
Okay, great. Group 4.
Okay, group 4. So we have one comment about the low price elasticity for protein. So my comment was that I usually would be more concerned if the price elasticity is too high. I wouldn't be necessary to be too concerned if the elasticity is too low. The reason being that if you have a very high price elasticity, what it says is if you tax or subsidize, you're going to get a large impact. And then the danger is always that the policymaker listen to your recommendation, and then a few years later, they don't find the intended effect. And then we embarrass ourselves, and then policymakers stop trusting us. So I usually am not concerned about very low elasticity, but instead very high elasticity. So personally, I'm not too concerned about that, but someone found that to be a little surprising. We can talk about that, which country or in which period. And the second comment I think is very useful is that to consider the implementation, the complication of implementing subsidies, price vouchers, cash transfers, how local authorities might make variation of those and make those even more effective or less effective. So I find that to be very thoughtful, but my comment is that there's no direct way for the statistical, for the econometric model, we have to address those things, but we can certainly put those into the discussion, and sometimes maybe we can consider the modeling predictions to be an upper or lower bound of what might happen on the ground. I said one example, US parallel would be, say, I think we got 7 cities taxing sugar sweetened beverages, and what happens is you'll start taxing sugar sweetened beverages, then people cross the border, they go outside the city limit to buy untaxed soda, and all those complications are very hard to address in the model itself, but it does allow us to say what's the upper bound of the real policy. So these are the 2 comments I think are most I would like to highlight.
Great. So I think we're at 15 minutes. So I don't know if group 5 can have us a 30-second response.
Actually, we did not have participants in the French group, so I was part of group 4. Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Perfect. So yeah, I think questions are being asked in the chat and answered in the chat. So I think we can move on. So that our next, we'll have a next breakout with Christine leading that.
Thank you, John. Now this session, we are going to jump into a breakout session again, but this time in a different, the sessions are formulated differently. And we are going to answer some 3 questions. The idea of this session is to help all of us think through the results, and not just the results only, but also the thinking of demand analysis, this kind of analysis. How can you use this consumer demand analysis in terms of in your day-to-day work? Do you think it's applicable, for example? And how can you, in your own field, use it? So the 3 questions we are going to answer in our groups. One is, which consumer demand principles are most relevant to your work? And then, given what you have learned about consumer demand today, so starting from what Chen took us through in the earlier session, and then Ellen, and then the results, and finally the discussions we've been having, do you think you might incorporate some of these concepts in your work, or even the analysis or this kind of modeling? If yes, how, and if no, why? And what are some of your takeaways from this on consumer preferences and food systems from this lab? So just some insights. We'll be happy to hear a bit on those 3 questions as you break into your breakout sessions. And the breakout sessions will be grouped, not now in terms of expertise, but in terms of your practice. Like, are you working in a interdisciplinary research team? Are you working in a disciplinary research group? Are you in monitoring, for example, monitoring learning and evaluation, in implementation, in funding? So these kind of groupings, you're going to see them, and then you can pick which of those groups you like. We use the same Google Doc that you filled in the first session, but now the breakout session 2 is further below, but on the same Google Doc.
Okay, thank you so much. I know everybody has a busy afternoon, day ahead of them. I am just going to share, sharing my screen? No. I'm going to share, let's see here. I'm about to share our presentation. I mean, we have a link to a post survey, and so we will paste this into the chat also, and just say that please do reach out to us if you have any questions. We're happy to continue this discussion. Thanks for bearing with us on a very ambitious agenda for 2 hours. But you know, we would love your thoughts, your reflections, if you have any additional ones as you're going over the results. And I'll flag that we have some more policy-focused country-level demand systems work coming out, led by some of today's participants, along with this group. And we would really welcome your feedback in the post-session survey. So I will stick around if anybody has any additional questions. And again, thank you for your participation and engagement in this session.
Great. Thank you so much, Ellen, and all of our other facilitators for this excellent session. I just want to remind everyone you can find the rest of the program for ANH Academy Week on our website. There are more learning labs today and tomorrow, and then a research conference next week, where we'll continue to hear about many of these topics.